Of course, if you have heard of us before and you've been to one of our webinars or to one of our events, you know that everything we do is based in science. So everything that we bring to you, product-wise, protocol-wise, what we're going to talk about today, this is all based upon peer-reviewed research, research from the literature that's out there. So that is the foundation that we stand on, everything backed in science. We have now over 160 protocols that we've developed based around tree and shrub care specifically. And we offer all kinds of different trainings throughout the country. Our company values, again, I always like to call it a few of these. You know, when we go to work at Rainbow, we align to, you know, living and breathing these company values. And of course, the science-based, as we discussed, and finally the honesty, integrity. Again, everything we're bringing you here, everything we bring into the marketplace is backed in science, and we're giving you the best possible recommendations that we can muster up. So today, of course, we're going to be talking about Cytospora Canker. So our intended outcomes for this talk today is going to be, of course, defining what is Cytospora Canker. We'll talk about symptoms of Cytospora Canker. We'll go through the life cycle of Cytospora Canker. We'll do a deeper dive into Cytospora Canker on conifers specifically, and then we'll conclude with practical protocols for treating Cytospora Canker in the landscape. So, of course, if you're not aware of what Cytospora Canker is, it is a fungal canker-forming disease. Like many other canker diseases, it is a fairly weak pathogen. It wants to go after trees that are already under some form of stress. And for many of us, that is going to be drought stress and or too much water stress. So in these situations where we have drought or situations where we have saturated soils, we find that we have an increased instance of Cytospora Canker. It is in the Violaceae family, and it's made up of there's several genera of this disease that all call what we call commonly Cytospora Canker, very much like anthracnose. Anthracnose leaf disease is a combination of several genera, very much Cytospora is that same way. And the ones that we are most concerned of in the landscape are, again, the genera Cytospora, Leucostoma, and Balsal. And if we look at specific species here, the ones that we deal with most often are this Leucostoma kunzi. And so this would be the Cytospora disease that affects our trees in the pine or the Pinaceae family. So blue spruce, this is the disease that would get that. And the Balsa sorted here, this is the disease that we often see affecting our fruit trees, so peaches, cherries, plums, for those of us that are worried with that type of Cytospora Canker. And so again, as I mentioned, the Cytospora Canker can be several different species of fungi that are attacking a large host range of woody ornamentals. And so it's known on more than 70 different species of woody ornamental, everywhere, as you can see there, from aspens to our Rosaceae family trees like apple, cherry, peach, plum, and mountain ash, as well as honey locust, willow, birch. And of course, we often think of it affecting our spruce species. Many of us throughout the country dealing with it on blue spruce. Interesting enough, so some Cytospora species can be host specific, while others can affect several different species of tree. But as an example, the species of Cytospora that affects willow, cottonwoods, and aspen are all affected by one species. So that specific group of plants will only be affected by one type of Cytospora Canker, which is interesting. If we start to look at symptoms of Cytospora Canker, of course, we think of that as a canker, of course. So they can be these cankered, sunken areas along a branch, as illustrated in this picture. They can also see this other sunken area here where you see a difference between healthy tissue and diseased tissue. And again, we're not necessarily seeing the signs of the canker here, but we can see that symptom there, that sunken area on a tree branch. We can see bark cracking along that branch as well. And so again, something like a fruit tree, this is where we would often find this, where we see this cracked bark associated with the canker, as well as the sunken area, as we saw earlier. And eventually we can see these black pinhead-sized speckles or pimples, and this, of course, would be the fruiting structures starting to form on the cankered area of the tree here. So here's some things we'd be looking for from a diagnostic standpoint. Now, of course, with an aggressive attack of Cytospora Canker, and again, these are going to be on trees that are already predisposed to stress. We might not see any of these cankers, and we might just see just sudden and rapid branch death, as shown here on this peach tree in the left picture, where we just get a sudden girdling of the plant, and likewise over in our picture on the right, where we have several just suddenly dead areas of a spruce tree. Some other symptoms that we could be looking at here, again, is the bark above the infected area may appear sunken and yellow-brown, as you can see here in this picture here. We also might get an odorous brown, smelly substance within the actual canker itself. So these are some other issues to be looking at when we're trying to diagnose Cytospora canker over another disease. Now, if you look kind of narrow in on a few different species of plant that it affects, on aspen, it forms this very characteristic kind of orangish sheen on the bark here, and that would be associated with this kind of orangish liquid oozing. And so this, again, is you're walking through an aspen stand, specifically more out in our mountainous areas out west, you would notice this. And again, you know, out west, we often have issues with long periods of drought, and this could be associated with aspens in this situation here. So it's pretty characteristic there on these aspen trees. Now, again, if we're looking at trees in, again, the Rosaceae family, specifically here, trees in the genus Prunus, we can also see this gummy ooze, which we often call gummosis. So this gummosis would be also characteristic of the Cytospora canker on trees in the Prunus family. Now, of course, there are a lot of different things that can cause gummosis on one of these trees. Botrosphaeria canker, as is pictured here, is also a very common canker disease on, again, stressed trees in this genus of trees. And so, again, these would be managed pretty much the same, but again, if you're really trying to split hairs here, knowing the difference between Botrosphaeria and Cytospora, that would, of course, have to be cultured out in the lab. The other thing we might get here is not actually a disease at all, but an insect, and this would be the greater peach tree borer or the lesser peach tree borer can also, as it's boring through the tree will respond by creating this gummy gummosis to try to block the insect out. Now, this would be a little bit easier to distinguish from Cytospora canker than Botrosphaeria canker, is that within this gummy ooze, you would see actual frass from the insect. So you would see parts of the tree as it is burrowing through mixed in with this gummy ooze. And so that's how you would be able to tell the difference between Botrosphaeria or Cytospora and this insect. And for better or worse, we have some pretty good ways of managing these peach tree borers. So peach tree borer is actually, it's a clear wing borer. So it is in the Lepidopteran group of insects. It's a moth. And so we could do preventative treatment of things like permethrin or bifenthrin, which would be Tengard or Bifen-XTS. Or, of course, this long word down here is acelloprin, which would also work as a bark treatment. So we could time these bark treatments to around when the adults are active in laying eggs. And so from a growing degree day standpoint, the lesser peach tree borer is active earlier in the spring, between 350 and 375 growing degree days. That's when we're beginning to see those first adults emerge. And then the greater peach tree borer comes out a little bit later on in the year. And again, that would be 575 to 710 growing degree days. So both still kind of early spring pests, but again, we could manage those pretty well with some of our product choices there. If we look at our life cycle of Cytospora canker, again, this has a life cycle very similar to just about most of our other canker diseases, as well as, you know, again, a lot of our fungal diseases. And so, again, it's going to start here on these cankers. So it'll overwinter on the cankers on the tree. In the early spring, we'll start to see these, black, pimply fruiting structures begin to form. That's a close-up of what that'll look like. And then they form, which is really neat. This, again, all of our different Cytosporas, at least on our broadleaf trees, are going to form this pycnidia, which is this really cool orangish goo. And so that's just a close-up of that pycnidial spore. So again, if you're walking through a stand of, specifically here, if we're looking at a stand of maybe, peach trees or cherry trees, and they're not looking good, and again, this is spring or so, and we start seeing this gooish stuff here. This isn't the actual gummosis. This is this kind of fruiting structure, I guess you would call it on these things. This pycnidia is a way to think of it. And this pycnidia, this is where these spores will be released from. And of course, these can be rain splashed. They can be blown through the air as well. And then what we get here is an invasion of the bark, and what it wants to do is move into the bark and start causing damage. Will start causing this new canker. And of course, as I've mentioned already, this is really going to be on our trees that are already stressed out. So if we have a tree that is going to be predisposed to stress, really in most cases it's due to drought, something of that nature, that's where we'll start seeing a big instance of this disease. And when we talk about protocols, that's going to be a big part of the protocol, is really strategies for making the plant healthy. And so if we just kind of move away from those broadleaf trees for a second and start looking at Cytospora Canker on conifers, we'll see we have a whole list of susceptible trees. And really, when we're looking at these susceptible trees, they can be susceptible anywhere in the country, but where we see the highest instance of Cytospora Canker as really a landscape disease is when we're taking some of these species like a Colorado blue spruce or a Douglas fir, and we're putting them into a landscape that they're not readily adapted to. And we'll talk about that in just a little while. But again, if you take a tree out of its native habitat and you put it into, say, you take something like Colorado blue spruce and you put it into a Midwestern landscape, you add either too much irrigation or you have no irrigation in times of drought, you're going to have an instance where you can really have a disease that can move in and do damage to a tree. If we look at the symptoms on conifers as compared to symptoms on the broadleaf trees, one is, of course, you'll get this sunken resinous area that can you see callus tissue, almost like a gall forming on some of these branches. And again, this can be, anywhere from, just a few millimeters in diameter, up to a few inches in diameter. And so this, of course, would be the most distinguishing thing. And this is, those of us managing this disease in the landscape with conifers, this is what we probably see pretty often. Now, this white ooze is very characteristic. If you think about really, obviously when sap dries, it often dries and it looks white. But when you injure a tree and you have healthy sap coming from the tree, it's this amber color. So if you see a white color, so a white sticky oozing, that is characteristic of Cytospora Canker, versus if you have other oozing, which again, through windstorms, through various other events, you could wound a tree and see some resin. But again, healthy resin is going to be that ambery color, versus with Cytospora, it'll be that whitish color. So that would be, again, this is a key way to distinguish this disease compared to other diseases. Again, this will form those black fruiting structures, so you can see those right there within that canker. As it begins to girdle the branch, the needles on that branch are going to turn that yellow color and slowly turn to that reddish color. This is going to be pretty, again, as you're looking around, it's going to be a distinguishing fact here. As you're looking at a tree, you start seeing that kind of that blue to pale green to yellow to reddish color on the needles. And of course, like many of other canker diseases and other fungal diseases, it'll slowly, usually starts lower on in the crown where the conditions are most suitable to its development, and slowly over the years move up throughout the crown, as you can see represented in this particular photograph. Now again, we have a lot of different trees that are susceptible to this disease. When we look at, though, we dial down more into what specific condition of a tree will make it more, again, suitable to be attacked, we see it's often in trees over 15 years old. And now that maybe that's like the turning point. We know young trees are very vigorous, grow very fast. And so the theory is maybe at about 15 years of age in the landscape, this is that turning point for this tree, or maybe the vigor's slowing down. You know, it's been living in an environment that has, you know, not been very well suited to where that plant wants to be for a long period of time. And now these canker diseases like Cytospora can start moving in. You know, we talked about this already, trees under stress, trees of low vigor, trees with shallow roots. And again, we know trees with shallow roots, and this not necessarily might be a species dependent thing, but a species and or a site dependent thing where we have a very compacted subsoil, or for some reason, you know, the tree is not able to sink roots deeper down into that soil to collect resources. This is where, again, if we see trees that are affected, this is one of the characteristics we see. And of course, these trees growing on unfavorable sites. And of course, you see this blue spruce growing someplace in the northeast where it doesn't want to be growing to begin with. It has turf right up to the base of it. You know, we have this walking path here. This is not exactly a suitable site for this Colorado blue spruce. Now, of course, there is a numerous amount of other diseases that can mimic Cytospora canker. And so it's important to note whether or not you are actually dealing with Cytospora canker, or if you're dealing with Cytospora canker or some of these other diseases, because some of these other needle diseases are going to be, again, fairly easy to manage with properly timed treatments of you know, different products, different fungicides. And so the first thing that comes to mind is Rhizosphere needlecast. Again, if you see this picture here on the left, the Rhizosphere needlecast, it can be very, I mean, this would be very easy to misdiagnose as Cytospora canker. You might very well have Cytospora canker coming in here as well, where you're starting to see whole branches die off, starting at the bottom and moving its way up. Now, a key thing with this Rhizosphere needlecast is the way the symptoms progress throughout the tree, whereas you will start to see this more of this reddish color forming fairly quickly. And again, you'll start seeing this in fall, and then you'll see it again in the spring. And with this Rhizosphere, the way it works is it infects the needles early on in the spring, and it affects new needles. But you don't start seeing the symptoms of the disease until mid-late summer, fall, or even spring that following year. And so with Rhizosphere, you'll often have these kind of green tips on the tree, at least early on before they kill the whole branch. And then you'll start seeing this kind of reddish material, this reddish, these needles forming later on into the season and into next year. Now, this is one of these things where this could be a conifer, where you're actually getting, you know, this Rhizosphere is obviously going to stress out the tree. And so if we compound stresses, this would be an opening for Cytospora canker as well. So it would behoove you to manage this Rhizosphere prior to the tree getting Cytospora, and that would just be one more issue. And of course, with Rhizosphere, you'll see these black fruiting structures forming within those infected needles, where again, Cytospora canker is going to be there on the twigs, branches, or stems. You'll see this Rhizosphere there, that fruiting body forming right there on the needle. Now, treatment-wise, again, as I mentioned, you know, with proper timing, we can manage Rhizosphere. We could use products like Mancozeb or Junction. You'd want to time it again when the needles are about half length to 2 inches in length, depending upon, of course, that 2 inches length is going to be depending upon the species of plant, but about half length. That's when we want to start treating this disease. Again, this is a springtime disease. It likes those young needles. And you want to have a pretty tight treatment window of 7 to 14 days while those conditions that are conducive to disease inoculation are present. So again, we can manage this fairly easily. This is where diagnostics plays a huge role when it comes to managing plant diseases, making sure we know which disease we're actually managing for. The other issue that we might see that can potentially people might think is Cytospora canker and mimic Cytospora canker, of course, would be Diplodia tip blight. So again, Diplodia tip blight, while this can eventually form a canker, generally in the early stages, what we're seeing here is we have this kind of rapid death of that first year's growth. And so this first year's growth, or this year's growth, I guess you would say, is being infected by Diplodia. and we see this rapid kind of death. And this is very characteristic where you have this slumping terminal newish growth here. Now, again, this can be managed with properly timed fungicide treatments as well. So a product like T-Bird can be applied at bud break through the candle extension. So as that new growth is maturing, and again, at about a 10 to 14 day treatment interval, and we can manage this disease. And again, just like Rhizosphaera, a heavy dose of diplodia or heavy damage by diplodia can just be one more spoke in that wheel of stress, and again, open up the tree to Cytospora Canker. So that's important to note. There are also some other cankers that, again, are very similar to Cytospora Canker that would affect the spruce trees. The big one is Phomopsis canker. Again, this is a very small canker. It's not as dramatic looking as Cytospora Canker can be. It's inconspicuous just under the bark. And we talk about this as having the needle cast symptoms without the needle cast signs. So again, with this here, you would see needles fall off, but you would not see that fruiting body on the needle because, again, this is living in that twig. So with Cytospora, you'd have a few other distinguishing features of the canker. Again, we would be able to see possibly some of that resin. We'd be able to see some of those fruiting bodies. With the needle cast, again, we'd be able to see those fruiting bodies on the needle themselves. With this, you wouldn't have either one of those, and you would have just like a very small piece of streaking just under the affected area of the bark, as distinguished kind of poorly in this blurry picture here I have for you. The other thing, of course, we might have that might look like Cytospora Canker, and we misidentify Cytospora Canker, of course, as the spider mite, specifically here the spruce spider mite, which is a cool season mite. Again, you could get that bronzing of the interior foliage. The interior foliage in very high populations of mite can be aborted and fall off, which would give that kind of appearance of a canker disease. And as we know, to check for mites, what you would need to do is do that kind of paper test. So you would take a nice white sheet of paper, you would slap those needles down on that paper, and then you would observe for mites either with a hand lens, or of course you can do a little hand smear and see if you have any little red streaks there. And that would be, again, a sign that you have spider mite damage there. And just like there are other diseases that we mentioned, spider mites, while they might not be a primary stressor, they can be one of those things that just add one more spoke to that wheel of stress and can open up the tree to Cytospora Canker. Now, of course, we know we have a whole host range of products that treat spider mites fairly well. So again, kind of pick your poison with miticides. The key there, of course, would be to treat when either the mite is active or read the label, because we have some miticides that will have some efficacy on the eggs. Horticultural oil would also potentially be an option here, depending upon the species and the rate and things like that. So when we start actually now talking about Cytospora Canker, we have to really pay attention to this disease triangle, or as we teach it nowadays, as this disease pyramid. And of course, we won't need to break this, but the big thing we need to talk about here, of course, is that pathogen is pretty much always going to be around in the environment. It comes down to the host, so plant selection, and then that conducive environment, and then time, which is kind of the base of this period as that conducive environment. And so if we can do any of this, if we can break up this cycle in any way, then of course we're not going to have disease. And so the first thing we talk about is modifying the host. And so for many of us in the Midwest and East Coast, when we think of Cytospora Canker, the first thing we think about is Colorado blue spruce. They seem to go together like peas and carrots. And so what we're seeing here, we're seeing the native host range of Colorado blue spruce. And I want you to take note of where that is. So all of this dark green is where we find Colorado blue spruce. Notice that it seems to be in association with western mountains and not in, again, clayey, Midwestern, Northeastern soils. The other thing to take note of is where that plant is growing in these high elevation mountains. And so Colorado blue spruce, if you were to go walk up a mountain out west there, you would find Colorado blue spruce growing along these high elevation mountain streams. So they like to grow at higher elevations in low humidity next to a running stream that has, so they have plenty of water available to them, but again, it's kind of in this well-drained type soil here. And so this is where we want to find Colorado blue spruce, not in Mrs. Jones's front yard in central Ohio, or, again, Mr. Smith's, backyard in southeastern Pennsylvania. And so that's where we see the most of our issues with Cytospora canker. Specifically, if you recall that species list, again, Douglas fir, again, a tree that is going to be growing, at higher elevations, or even, again, in different conditions than where they're often planted, the Colorado blue spruce. So this is the number one issue why we have Cytospora canker in other parts of the country, is that that plant is not adapted to being in that environment. The other thing, of course, we have to do here, it's really about modifying that site. So we need adequate soil moisture. Again, when I think of the Colorado blue spruce, which to me is just the poster child for Cytospora canker throughout the country, they're often planted in poorly drained clay soils, which means they have wet feet for half of the year. Most of the eastern parts of the United States experience some kind of summer drought. Not always, of course, but very often we experience some kind of summer drought. So we have a tree that is growing in this clay soil that has wet feet throughout the spring. Then it gets hot, and it gets dry. As we know, that clay soil can, again, it can dry out really quickly. And then become almost hydrophobic in some cases. So we're dealing with these issues here these trees are growing in. The soil moisture is a huge issue. Of course, root collar excavation, and then proper fertilization and adjusting pH is going to be huge. Because again, if I've said it once, I've said it a million times. Really the key here with any of these canker diseases is they want to go after a tree that's already stressed out. There are very few malevolent canker diseases that are going after a healthy tree, specifically when we talk about Cytospora canker in the species that we've talked about so far today. The other thing here with our Cytospora canker is it needs available free water. And so if you're blasting these trees with overhead irrigation, you're constantly creating a situation where this canker can reproduce and reinfect. And so going to this example of we have a tree that's growing in a poor soil, in an environment that tree is not adapted to be in. You could have a tree that is under drought stress, but it's getting hit with overhead irrigation every day, in which case it might not be getting the adequate soil moisture, but its foliage is being wet, the interior of the plant is getting wet. That Cytospora canker is going to take advantage of that environment, continue to reinfect, so you're compounding your situation. And of course, the solution to that would be just, change your irrigation routine around. We know that correct mulching is going to be huge. So again, it's all about making these plants healthy. Root collar excavations, proper mulching, proper watering. These are all going to play a role in making sure Cytospora canker is going to be happy, or making sure the tree is happy and healthy, and not a good place for Cytospora canker to invade. A big part of Cytospora canker management as well is going to be pruning out of the canker. We talk about this often with disease management, that any part of a disease management protocol is going to involve removing the inoculum. And in this case here, Cytospora cankers are going to be in the tree, they're going to be on the twigs. So we need to identify where that Cytospora canker is and then prune it out. And so, you see a picture of a tree like this and it looks like, oh man, this tree is going to just look naked if I prune all this out. It can actually, again, improve the aesthetic of the tree too, to take out some of those damaged, again, that dead wood that has been created by Cytospora canker. Also, by thinning it out, you're going to create some airflow through there. So the inside of the branches are going to stay drier, they'll dry off faster. And so you won't have that, that entryway for that Cytospora canker to move in and start doing damage. We say as just the best management practice, you want to do this in periods, of dry periods. And again, the reason for that is Cytospora canker wants to move in through wounds, so it can move in through pruning wounds. And again, Cytospora canker needs mild temperatures and adequate moisture to invade the plant. So if we do it during periods where we're not going to get rain, it allows the plant to begin to callus over, and then of course it allows, it is not going to allow that disease to even grow in that situation there. Now, we talk a lot about the stress of the plant and reducing stress, and so we know that using growth regulators that we can reduce the stress of trees. And basically what we're doing is we're asking the plant to reallocate resources away from top growth and putting it into these different energy buckets that we can then help the plant to, again, be more resilient to these urban suburban areas. And so what we're doing is by reducing the amount of gibberellin, which is responsible for cell elongation and expansion, we're asking the plant to increase some more beneficial both compounds and hormones within itself. And so what we see from a hormonal change is when we ask the plant not to produce so much gibberellin, it shifts gears and it starts producing more abscisic acid. And this is specifically with cambistat application, as we stop the synthesis of gibberellin, or we reduce the amount of gibberellin that is being synthesized, and as a side effect, we are increasing the amount of abscisic acid that's being synthesized. And so again, what we see here is we see an increase in fine root growth, we see an increase in drought resistance, and we see the increase in phytodefense compounds. And I talk about this very often when we talk about abscisic acid. One of the big things that abscisic acid does is it asks the stomates to close. And so people always say, well, if the stomates are closed for a greater period of time, then isn't that a negative effect because the stomates are closed and photosynthesis can happen. And so what abscisic acid does is it allows the plant to respond faster to drought conditions. And so basically, if we look at this graphic, the roots realize the plant is under drought stress. So again, if you think about a blue spruce that's growing midsummer in one of these clay soils where we haven't had a lot of precipitation and there's been no supplemental irrigation, the roots realize that it's starting to run out of water. They send this chemical signal up through the stem into the leaf, and that's where that stomate closes. And we have more abscisic acid produced in the plant. It's just that the plant can respond to this faster. And so that is what we're doing here, is we're allowing the plant to respond faster to these drought situations, which again is going to reduce stress. And of course, there's this little nugget here at the bottom that says compacted soils, concrete runoff, and warmer soil can all cause drought stress on a plant. And so again, we've talked about we're putting these plants into these urban suburban soils outside of where they want to be growing at this high elevation mountain stream, and we are just inducing stress into them by planting them where we are trying to plant them. Just to paint this picture a little bit more, if we look at some data from Dr. Glenn Percival and we look at survivability under drought-induced conditions, we have oak trees here that were induced to drought. In our untreated plants, there was 20% survival of those plants. In our treated plants at different rates, we had 100% survival. So just illustrating the point that we can help trees be more drought resistant in these urban-suburban interfaces. And one of the primary causes of Cytospora canker is drought-induced stress. As I mentioned again, what we're going to do here by using plant growth regulators like cambistat is we're just going to alter how the plant is using its resources. So by asking the plant not to synthesize so much gibberellin, it's going to not put on as much top growth. It's still going to be collecting the same amount of resources the plant is. It's going to be collecting the same amount of resources from the soil, same amount of solar energy. It can just take those resources and put them into different components. So again, root growth, which is going to help with drought resistance, and defense compounds, which again, when you're talking about something like a canker disease, is going to be beneficial. And so just to paint this picture a little bit more, what we're looking at here is this data that is stating that as plants grow, put on more tip growth, so as tip growth gets larger and grows faster, the plant has to take resources away from defense compounds. So again, if we can artificially ask the plant not to grow as vigorously it will be able to reinforce these defense compounds, which again, when we're talking about diseases, can be very beneficial. And this is right from our best management practice when we talk about increase in roots, which again is going to help the plant be more resilient in these situations. You know, paclobutrazol, which is the active ingredient in Cambistat, may increase length and dry weight of regenerated roots in some species. And this is just some more data to illustrate that. When we looked at reducing top growth here, we see an increase in that fine root growth there. And then finally, we can see that by using paclobutrazol, which is the active ingredient in Cambistat, we're getting similar results in fine root growth when we compare this to radial trenching, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, where you're affecting areas of soil around a tree and encouraging fine roots to grow in those areas. And we're getting similar results to when we combine the two. And this is a direct quote from Dr. Watson's research, which was then replicated, started in '96 and then replicated in '04. And it says this treatment may be effective in stabilizing declining trees with insufficient fine root development. And then finally, some more data from Dr. Watson, where he actually tested this theory of whether or not we can induce resistance in Cytospora Canker with blue spruce. And this is right from, was published in the Journal of Arboriculture and Urban Forestry. And what we are seeing here is that when we apply paclobutrazol, Cambistat at different rates, we're seeing a reduced instance of Cytospora Canker when compared to our controlled treatments or untreated treatments. So we do have data to support the fact that using plant growth regulators like Cambistat can induce an effect in blue spruce to make it more resilient from Cytospora Canker. Again, that would just be one tool in the toolbox. You would still want to go about doing things like improving the soil, root collar excavations, proper fertilization, doing decompaction treatments, as this here would be a big thing, as well as doing the pruning to remove the inoculum. But again, we see here, if you guys aren't familiar with this root enhancement process, basically what we're doing is we are reinvigorating the soil as a way of thinking. We're taking poor soil and we are affecting it to be more conducive to root development, especially in these clay soils where we often find these blue spruces planted. And so what we're doing is we're taking an air spade and we're decompacting a predetermined area of soil around the tree. We are then going to add soil amendments to the soil based upon a soil sample. We'll apply Cambistat in this case here, because what we'll be able to do is, again, we know Cambistat is going to help improve fine root development. So we decompact the soil, we add in our soil amendments to make the, again, get the soil exactly to where we need it to be, apply Cambistat as the plant to produce more fine root growth, and then, of course, we're going to want to go over it with a nice layer of mulch, at least 4 inches of mulch, and we're going to want to water all that back in to make sure that we're rehydrating the soil around that tree. And with that, we see just phenomenal results when it comes to managing trees, making them healthier, and again, affecting a really great positive response in the tree. So to wrap things up before we look at some questions, Cytospora Canker is a stress-induced disease that affects several species of trees. So again, this is purely a stress-induced disease in most of our landscapes. There are several pathogens and pests that are similar symptoms to Cytospora Canker, so it's important to go through your diagnostic steps to realize what is truly affecting the tree before you apply a treatment for that specific pest or disease. The key to managing Cytospora Canker is to keep trees healthy, as we have said several times, and Cambistat can be used as part of a protocol to manage tree health and Cytospora Canker resistance, as illustrated in the peer-reviewed research that has come up. As a note, of course, we provide all forms of resources. So we have an opportunity guide that's associated with Cambistat that helps with giving ideas of when to use Cambistat, how to use Cambistat, how it can improve not only your return on investment when it comes to pruning, but also in keeping trees healthy and maintaining them in a large period of time. We also have a host of diagnostic guides that are available to you. Again, you can go to our website, treecarescience.com. We talked about Rhizospora as part of this discussion today, so you can learn more specifically here about Rhizospora and some of our other needle diseases and other plant and pest diseases and pests. And then finally, we're going to have, I believe we're going to have a few more webinars, but the next one we have that is you're able to go on and register for now is going to be for emerald ash borer treatment strategies and options, which will be this Thursday. Again, it's 11 a.m. Central, be 12 p.m. Eastern, and it's going to be a great one. Jeff Cachet is going to be talking about this. He's my counterpart up there in the Northeast, and that should be a really great talk. And with that, we'll open it up for questions. Just give me one moment here. I'm going to pop open the question box, and we'll see if anybody has any questions.